Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the AFLFC podcast. We're delighted this morning to have as our guest Mark Labine, the president of the French American Heritage Foundation of Minnesota. Mark Labine graduated from the University of Minnesota in 1977 and received a JD from Hamline University School of Law in 1980. He practiced law and worked part-time as a contract administrative law judge, arbitrator, magistrate, referee, and mediator until June 2005, when he was appointed to be court referee for Hennepin County District Court. Mark has served on the board of directors of the Ramsey County Bar Association, Midway YMCA, St. Anthony Park Business Association, as Minnesota Association of Mediators, both as president, Conflict Resolution Minnesota, Tarryton Condo Association president, the St. Mary's Men's Club treasurer, the West Side Voice newspaper, and the Hamline Law Alumni Association. He served on the Parks Commission and Finance Committee for the City of Arden Hills and was a member of the District 12 Community Council for the City of St. Paul. Mark has taken a keen interest in his French-Canadian ancestry and genealogy. He served as president of the Société Canadienne Française du Minnesota from 1988 to 1990 and has written a number of books on his family history and ancestors. His latest book, Ancestral Pathways, documents over 1,700 of his ancestors, including many ancestral lines that go back to France. Welcome, Mark. We're delighted to have you here with us today.
Glad to be here.
Please tell us about your French-Canadian heritage and how it has influenced your life.
I was born and raised in a small town in northwestern Minnesota called Argyle. Argyle was a fairly vibrant French-Canadian community. The French Canadians lived pretty much on the east side of town along the river. They like to settle along the river. And on the east side of town was a lot of Polish immigrants, Polish and Eastern European. But, you know, my grandparents spoke French. I lived in my neighborhood. Pretty much everybody was French Canadian or had French Canadian ancestries. A lot of the people in my hometown had come from an area called Saint-Jean-Lachigan north of Montreal and had kind of come together as, you know, they were kind of interrelated family-wise. And my dad was a historian. My grandfather was a little bit too, and they talked a lot about family stories. We had storytellers in town, the old-fashioned French Canadian storytellers that told great stories, and I loved listening to my dad and these storytellers about, and they talk about their family and their grandparents and, you know, life on the farm. And, you know, and of course the French Canadians at that time were very strong Catholics and were very strongly influenced by the Catholic Church. So we did a lot of traditional French Canadian activities such as, you know, midnight mass, meat pie, blood sausage called boudin. We did a lot of plays. I think that was my dad explained, that was a very French Canadian thing to do. People would get together and they'd put on plays and act and play the fiddle and have little house dances. And, you know, we do that too. We did a lot of play acting for entertainment. That was a fun thing to do. So I was growing up in this culture that I didn't really know was French Canadian. I just assumed that was just the way things were. Most of us were farmers. And then, you know, in the 70s, I started going to school, and I went to France in 1976 and decided to look up my family name in Paris, and I found it. And, you know what, it kind of piqued the interest. You know, who are the Labines? You know, I say Labine. In Quebec, I think I say Labine, but, you know, who are we? And there was, you know, my grandfather used to say, well, our name was Labine Gidry. And we didn't really know what that meant. So my dad was always interested. So we started doing some research together, and my dad started writing letters. He was very good at that. And lo and behold, after about 5 years of writing letters, he found this priest or monk in Montreal that had our lineage all the way back. And it turns out that we had this connection to Acadia. Never really knew about that before. We were hardworking people and we worked hard. We had this community that had a strong French Canadian influence, but we didn't really think about it or talk about it. It wasn't really part of our awareness that we were, French Canadians. Didn't really think about where we came from. But all of a sudden now, in the 70s, we started to think more about our history. And I went to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and discovered all this information about our family history and our family past. And I decided, this is going to be lost unless I do something about it. So that's kind of what piqued me to start writing some books and documenting our French Canadian family history. And as I did that, I became more and more aware of the fact that, I did have this very strong French Canadian influence in my childhood, but we didn't really talk about it. We did Catholic things, we did Mardi Gras, we did a lot of stuff that had a French connection, but it wasn't something that we verbally talked about a lot. So that kind of got my interest in my French history. My mother is English, so I do have that interest also. I've done studies on her ancestry, but I've always had a special affinity for my French Canadian, I guess, roots.
Thank you for sharing that with us. That personal story is so captivating, so interesting. Please tell us a little bit now about your work as president of the French American Heritage Foundation of Minnesota.
Well, I got involved when I got done with law school. I got involved with a group called the Société Canadienne Française du Minnesota. Actually, there's been probably over 50 organizations in Minnesota through our history that have involved French culture or French heritage. And I discovered that as part of my research in one of the books that we wrote. But I got involved in this organization called Société Canadienne Française du Minnesota. Actually was the president for a couple of years. And so I met a lot of other people that had interest in French Canadian history and whatnot. And then I started having children, got married, was very busy, kind of dropped out for a while. And the group kind of folded. It just lost its energy to keep going. That happens to groups. It seems like groups do have a life. They start and they are very strong, and then they kind of peter out. But some of us talked about that and said, well, let's we should do something in Minnesota to promote and educate people about our French heritage. I mean, it's there, it's pretty strong. There's really not anybody that's doing much about it. So we formed the French American Heritage Foundation. And our purpose is really to promote and educate people about the French heritage through education and community events. And our basic premise was, let's do something about history because we all love history. Let's do something that's fun. Let's do some books and educational materials. And our basic format is we will find a speaker on a certain topic, and we have had no problems finding interesting topics to talk about, especially Minnesota has a very strong, very long French heritage and history. And we'll have the speaker, and we'll have a little wine and a little cheese and bread and hors d'oeuvres, and we'll find a neat little spot to meet that's kind of interesting, has some history component to it. And we'll have social contacts, and it's worked very well. And we don't have, we have an organization that's pretty footloose and fancy free. We don't get too hung up on promising too much. We don't really make a lot of promises to people. We do have a website that does take some administrative responsibility, but other than that, our promise is that we'll put on events, and when we decide to put on an event, then we make a commitment. But we don't have newsletters. We don't have things that we are required to do. Right now we're doing an article of the month, by the way, but that's because somebody's willing to do that. So we try to be fairly flexible, because my experience in organizations is that if you get too administratively burdened with too many administrative duties, you have a hard time finding volunteers, and those organizations tend to die out, like the Société. So the foundation is we're pretty flexible in terms of what we do. We do what we want to do. That's our only promise. People make donations to us and they're members, but we don't promise anything to them. They're not, it's not like we have this obligation to them. I mean, our obligation and our promise to them is that we're going to do interesting things. We're going to put on interesting events. we've written five books. Actually, no,
Impressive.
we have published 6 books on French heritage in Minnesota. I'm working on our 7th. We have put on a heritage brochure that talks about 25 sites in Minnesota that have French heritage to them, and we hired an artist to do that. We did a little fundraiser. It seems like there's a lot of interesting things that we can do. We've done quite a few things already, and there's a lot more things that we can do. And I think as long as we're having fun, as long as it's a social event type thing, as long as it's a way to reach out and talk to other people who have similar interests in doing something fun, like we're going to do our next event now. We didn't really do much in 2020, surprise, surprise. But our next event now, we're going to do an event at the Leduc House, which is an old mansion, an old Victorian mansion in Hastings. It was owned by this Frenchman whose father fought in the American Revolution with George Washington, and he was a general in the Civil War and had a very strong influence in early Minnesota, a Frenchman. And so we're going to do an event at his mansion. It's a beautiful place. It'll be a fun place to do an event. We'll try to have some wine and cheese, and we'll have a speaker come who knows a lot about General Leduc. And our latest idea is we want to start doing some reenactments. We want to start dressing up in 19th century costumes and trying to pick personalities of some of the early French settlers and pioneers in Minnesota, and try to do reenactment. I think I'm going to be doing a guy named Joe Roulette, who was a early French entrepreneur and fur trader. And we've got 10 or 12 personalities picked out. So that's going to be something that's going to be fun, I think. And we'll add a little spice to what we're doing. And hopefully we can, one of the things we want to do, and we've been doing this, we have this Fête Saint Jean Baptiste at the Sibley Historic Site. And the Sibley Historic Site it's a wonderfully restored area. It was a place called Mendota. And there's Henry Sibley he was a French speaking, he was the first governor of the state of Minnesota, French speaking, very involved with the French Canadian community. And there's a house there called the Hippolyte Dupuis House. He was a French Canadian who worked with Sibley and was a merchant and entrepreneur. And then there's another house called the Jean Baptiste Faribault House. So it has a very strong French Canadian and French heritage. And we want to do a festival there. We've been doing festivals there, but we want to try to spice it up a little bit and show up in costume and have French Canadian music and just kind of celebrate the French flair that Minnesota does have.
I think that approach is wonderful. You appeal to, I think, a variety of interests, all kinds of people and personalities. And that is the way, really, I think, to raise awareness, to make it enjoyable, to make it fun, to make it social. So I really think you are absolutely on the right track. Your event program and your plans, they sound wonderful.
Yeah, the idea is so it's fun. We want people to have fun. And then as long as it's fun, people will participate and donate to us. That's the idea.
Very wise. Now, a little slightly more general question. Could you please tell me your thoughts on the French language and Francophone culture in Minnesota generally, but also beyond Minnesota throughout the Midwest region of the country, which, as we all know, was really the heart of Nouvelle France?
Well, the French culture and history and heritage of Minnesota is pretty strong. They spoke French here for 200 years. It's one of our mottos before they became state. But the French have been, there were 79 communities in Minnesota that had French-speaking Catholic churches. They're all pretty much Catholic. Sisters of St. Joseph of Medaille and Carondelet. They were a French order. They were involved in starting and teaching at 94 different schools in Minnesota. So the French order of nuns were very strong and had a very strong influence in early education. This was before you had public education. So private education, Catholic schools were very, very important part of helping Minnesota become educated and becoming a early part of our state, so early part of our state history. I myself went to a Catholic school taught by the nuns of St. Joseph de Madai. They're dying out now. There are not as many private schools for various reasons, but there are still that still exist. So they had a strong influence in early Minnesota. Of course, you said earlier that the state motto in Minnesota is L'Etoile du Nord. I think it's the only state in the United States that has a French motto, and that's because most of the early legislators in Minnesota were French speaking. I mean, the first population here were the French, and first governor of Minnesota was French speaking, Henry Sibley. I mean, it was a very strong part of early Minnesota. So they've been around. Of course, we know that there are several different organizations that do promote and put on French cultural activities. The Alliance Française is pretty active and they do quite a few different things. We put on some events. There's a few other organizations that do promote French culture. I mean, French is part of the United States. Early in the United States, in the formation of the United States, it played an important role in our early history, and it should be remembered and celebrated. Of course, the French language is integrated into the English language. I don't know how many thousands and thousands of words we use every day have French roots. So I mean, the French language is part of what we do. We call it English, but it's a lot of English is French. And of course, I think you know that.
I wholeheartedly agree with everything you're saying. Now, looking to, I guess, the present and the future, what advice might you have for parents who want to either keep French as a heritage language in the home, or perhaps reintroduce or reacquire French as a family language?
Well, French is still a relevant language in the world. I mean, English is, of course, going to be the dominant language going forward, partly because it's a combination of so many different languages. English does have that flexibilities, but French is still pretty relevant. And if you're obviously teaching your kids two languages is really a great way to train their minds. And I think it's great for their development. I think, especially when they're young. I mean, learning more languages is just going to make their brain and make them that much smarter. But French is still relevant, and it'll be interesting to see what the French language does in the future. I think the future of the French language in the world is resting in Western Africa, where you have so many countries where French is the primary language, and that population is growing quite a bit. I think you probably have read this, but the populations of Europe and the United States are actually diminishing. We're not growing, at least the French speaking in France, but in Africa they still are. So the French language is still relevant in the world. If you learn French, you are going to be relevant. You're going to be able to use it. We have a French American Heritage Chamber of Commerce here in Minnesota. We do a lot of trade with Canada, and of course Canada has a strong French language presence. So learning French is still relevant. It's still going to be important, and it's still going to give you, I think, an advantage in the business world, at least. That would be my advice.
And I think that is great advice. I hear from any number of parents who either want to safeguard their heritage language, or who want to reacquire it, maybe are sorry that over the period of sometimes a couple of hundred years that it has been lost, sometimes not too long ago. Mark, this has been really very, very interesting. But before we go, are there any additional thoughts that you'd like to share with us today?
Well, like I said before, I just think that the French heritage has played an important role in the history and development of the United States, something to be remembered and celebrated. It adds a fun aspect, I think, to our lives. And I think, I like heritage events because it does enrich our lives, and makes it a little more fun, and gives you another perspective that can add a little spice to your life. So it's fun to do things.
So well said, Mark. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We so appreciate it. We look forward to hearing more from you hearing more about the French American Heritage Foundation of Minnesota, and who knows, maybe even attending an event. They sound great. Thank you so much for being here with us today and for all that you do. And good luck with those books.
Thank you.
À la prochaine.
Yes, à la prochaine.